Welcome back. In the last video, we looked at the 4 acts of the Kishotenketsu plotting method along with some of its history. Today, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and talk about some of the intricacies of the method. Let's get into it. A process, not a destination. I've found that in modern Western media, I can almost predict what's going to happen next by where we are in the 3-act arc of a story. It's like there are specific beats the writer wants to hit, and you can almost set your watch by them. If I'm at the 40-minute mark of a 90-minute movie, I know the midpoint and the meeting with the goddess are coming up. If I'm at the start of a 120-minute movie, I know the inciting incident will occur at about the 30-minute mark. But it's not so simple with Kishotenketsu. From my experience, the Japanese 4-act structure seems to be a bit fuzzier and more malleable. Kishotenketsu stories tend to focus more on carrying characters through a process of discovery than hitting points on a map. Writers of this style steer the perception of the audience toward the intended goal by the end of the act. The movie poster moment. In my previous articles and videos on plotting, I said it's helpful to imagine that your story was being made into a movie. If you take a snapshot of the beginning of the 2nd act, that would be the movie poster moment of the story. That's what the story is all about. I like to focus on the poster for the Fellowship of the Rings as my go-to example, but you should try it with the next movie you see. It's quite interesting. Remember, in a Kishotenketsu, the inciting incident and call to action aren't what the story is all about. The twist is what the story is all about. So the movie poster moment of a Kishotenketsu is closer to the middle rather than the beginning of the story. The length of an act in a Kishotenketsu also differs from Western media. According to the 3-act structure, the 1st act is about 25% of the story, the 2nd is about 50% of the story, and the 3rd act is the final 25% of the story. But the 4-act structure is organized differently. It was hard for me to get exact numbers on this, so my figures may be a little fudgy. The key, or the introduction, is roughly 12 to 13% of the story. The show, or the development, is still the longest as we build up to the reveal and the twist in the 3rd act. It's about 50% of the story. The 10, the twist, is about 25% of the story, and Ketsu, the conclusion, is the final 12 to 13% or so. For the sake of easy math, let's say we're writing a book with 10 chapters. The 1st chapter is the introduction, where we see the protagonist's ordinary world. The next 5 chapters should be the rising action of the 2nd act. The next 2 or 3 chapters should focus on your twist, where you jerk the carpet out from underneath your characters. The final chapter or so should be where we see the characters coming to terms with what's happened to them. And remember, the key point here isn't that they slay the dragon and head home with pockets full of gold. There's not necessarily any great resolution here. There can be, but it's not needed. By the deterministic nature of the style, it's okay to leave characters in a state of tension and unrest at the end. Loose ends are welcome in Kishotenketsu. Can you have a story with no conflict? You can according to Kishotenketsu. Conflict is about overcoming obstacles, and Kishotenketsu isn't about overcoming anything. Classically speaking, it's about sending a character's life into a tailspin and watching as they try to cope. An example would be a slice of life anime, where the goal is to portray the everyday lives of a person or group of people. In Western media, it's the protagonists and their allies who drive the story. The story is driven by their goals and their need to mold the world in their image. But in a Kishotenketsu, the story is often driven by the antagonists and their goals. The motivation for the protagonist isn't that important and doesn't really matter. They're being acted upon by forces outside of themselves and beyond their control. What matters is how they react to these pressures. Do they remain virtuous in the face of an unvirtuous rival, or succumb and perish? Kishotenketsu for secondary characters. An application for Kishotenketsu in Western media is to give secondary characters a Kishotenketsu arc. This works when you consider these secondary characters are being acted upon by an outside force. That force is the protagonist. In his article on Kishotenketsu, Nils Odland at mythicscribes.com shares how Han and Chewie's role in A New Hope could be a type of Kishotenketsu. It's very interesting and worth a read. Perhaps the most important consideration is how to end a story in a Kishotenketsu. Western media tends to end on a tight resolution. If not done right, Western audiences can feel cheated if everything isn't wrapped up in a bow, and not having a tight ending can make publishers nervous. But this is completely acceptable in Kishotenketsu. Kishotenketsu stories tend to end on an event or emphasis. They can end on a plot point, but they don't need to. Sometimes it's fine for them to just end. The point of the fourth act is to answer questions posed by the twist in a way that reframes the plot up to this point. When I say it ends on an event or emphasis, I mean it ends on an emphasis on the virtues displayed in the story. You could compare it to an Aesop's Fables or one of the parables of Christ in that regard. The point is that it ends with an event that emphasizes the beliefs or morals of the story. This can frustrate Western audiences and publishers since we're now adding new information to the story. You typically don't do that in a 3-act structure and instead endeavor to wrap everything up in a neat little bow by this point. But the growing popularity of anime and manga in the West is proof that it can work here too, if well done. And that's it for this video. There's far more to learn about the Kishotenketsu method than I'm able to tell in 2 short videos, but I think what I've given you is a good primer to get you started. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the Kishotenketsu method in action by looking at an anime that's readily available on Netflix or YouTube. I'll see you there. Until next time, good writing and Calamus Gladio Fortior.